Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the East Hampton Library this afternoon. And welcome to our folks at home that are in on Zoom. Uh, I'd like to take the time to introduce, we have Jeffrey Sussman today, who's going to be discussing his latest book, City Gangsters, about Las Vegas and the Mafia. And I think you'll find this talk very entertaining and informative. And for the folks at home, if anybody has any questions, when we get toward the end, you can place the questions in the chat, and then we'll direct it to the author. And then if anybody in-house has questions, you can raise your hand and we'll go around and take questions. And I'm just going to turn this microphone on. Oh, we're on already. Very good. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a very nice turnout. I didn't expect it, actually. Before I begin, I just wanted to read you the publisher's description of my book to give you an idea of what's being covered. The publisher has written that Sin City Gangsters is a whirlwind account of how the mob created Las Vegas, building and controlling gambling casinos and buying the favors of influential politicians. The book features such mobsters as Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Moe Dalitz, Sam Giancana, Tony Accardo, and Nick Civella, along with their agents and hired guns, Tony Spilotro, Lefty Rosenthal, and Donald Angelini. The casino owners transformed Vegas into an entertainment capital by building billion-dollar-plus resorts and hiring entertainers such as Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley. Sin City Gangsters is the only book that charts Las Vegas from early mob-owned casinos to billion-dollar resorts. Its cast of characters were exceedingly ambitious risk-takers who created a glittering mecca of sin and pleasure. Now, a number of people asked me how I got interested in writing this book. I had preceded this book with another one called Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. And one of the characters that I had written about in that book seems to turn up every place. And that was Bugsy Siegel, who went from New York to California and then to Las Vegas. But going farther back in my experiences, I met three people over the years who sparked my interest in writing about Las Vegas and the mob. One was a man named Big Julie Weintraub, who was like a character out of Guys and Dolls. He was about 6'5". He had a broken nose and a very engaging smile. And he was a jeweler in New York, but he was a compulsive gambler who loved playing craps. And he would lose, every time he went to Las Vegas, he'd lose $10,000 or $15,000. So he decided the only way that he could stop his losing streak was to start what were called junkets to Las Vegas. And he would transport high rollers, men who would spend $250 or $300 or lose $250 to $300,000 in a weekend or a week of gambling. And he would load them all onto a chartered plane and treat them like princes and fly them to Las Vegas, put them up at the best hotels, and they would lose $250 to $300,000. And he got a percentage of that, which covered his losses. So he made money on this. So he was very entertaining. He was a very funny guy, the way he described all of this. And the second encounter that I had was in the late 1970s, during the Christmas holidays. I was on vacation at a resort in Southern California called La Costa. And I was invited to someone's home who had a home on the grounds to a New Year's Eve party. And I was standing in the living room of this home with an elderly man, and we each had a drink in our hands. And he said, "Oh, my back hurts. I've got to sit down." And he sat down on the couch, and I sat down next to him. We began chatting, and I asked him his name. His name was Mars Kleinman, and I asked him what he did for a living. He said he and his partners used to own the Desert Inn Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, and he said that we sold it to Howard Hughes. And I asked, how did that come about? And he said, well, Howard Hughes arrived in 1966 in a sealed railroad car that was germ-free and was taken on a stretcher to the Desert Inn Hotel and Casino. And he arrived with dozens and dozens of his helpers, all of whom were Mormons, and so they neither drank nor gambled. And they took up the top 2 floors of the Desert Inn. And we reserved those top 2 floors for high rollers who would come during the holiday seasons, and they would lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we would comp them by giving them free rooms on the best floors in the hotel. And here was Howard Hughes and all these people taking up the top 2 floors and not gambling and not drinking. So we said to him through one of his emissaries that he either had to buy the hotel and casino or he had to get out. So the emissary came back to us and said, well, how much does he want for it? And do you want for it? And we decided on a price that was 4 to 5 times the value of the hotel, thinking that that he would say no and would move out. And instead he said, I'll buy it. And he proceeded to buy 12 hotel casinos in Las Vegas. And he became the largest owner of hotels and casinos in Las Vegas. And Morris told me that one night Howard Hughes was looking out of his bedroom window and he saw the sign for the Silver Slipper Casino blinking on and off. And he hated that. So he said to his emissary, go out and buy that hotel for me. And he went out and bought it and got rid of the sign so he wouldn't have to look at it anymore. And the third event that occurred that sparked my interest in Las Vegas, I had my own marketing PR business for 30 years. And one of my clients was a trucking company in Chicago. And I would go out to see the owner of it periodically. And while I was there, he invited me for dinner at a private club that he belonged to in downtown Chicago. And I got there a little early and I saw him sitting at the bar with another man. And I went over and he introduced me to him. He said, Jeff, this is Tony. Tony, this is Jeff. And then he said to me, why don't you go sit in the dining room, tell the maitre d' you're with me, and I'll be in about 10 or 15 minutes. And he came in and I said, who was that? And he said, oh, that's a man named Tony Accardo. He's head of what's called the Outfit out here, which is like, the biggest organized crime organization in Chicago. And he was helping me because some of my trucks were being hijacked and they were pilfering from my trucks. And he said that he would take care of it, that none of this would happen again. Then he pulled out a large button from his coat. It must have been about this big. And on it was a picture of this man who he was sitting with. And it said, happy birthday, Big Tuna. And he was known as Big Tuna because he loved fishing. And my client said to me, he said, wear this button any place in Chicago and no one will bother you. He said, you could probably go into a bank and rob it and nothing would happen to you. So those were the 3 events that kind of sparked my interest in writing this book. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I started off with Bugsy Siegel, who is credited as the original mobster to start Las Vegas. And that was portrayed in the movie Bugsy with Warren Beatty. I don't know if you saw that movie. It's not entirely accurate because what happened is it was a man named Billy Wilkerson who owned the Hollywood Reporter and several very prominent restaurants in Beverly Hills. And he had started building the Flamingo and he ran out of money. And banks wouldn't lend money to casino owners or casino builders because they thought it was too risky. So he went to the mob and borrowed the necessary funds that he needed to complete the building. And the mob consisted, the people specifically that he borrowed from was a mob controlled by Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano, who were head of what was known as the National Crime Syndicate. And they formed a corporation, and then they demanded that Billy Wilkerson sell them his shares in this new corporation. Initially, he refused, and then they almost put a gun to his head and said, you better sell or we'll kill you. And so he sold them the shares, and then he went and lived in France for a year because he was frightened that they would kill him. And as this was being built, he had hired a man named, what his name, Wilbur something. Anyway, who he was a contractor for the building, and he heard, that these people. And so he was very worried, and he said to Bugsy, he said, if I make a mistake in any way, are you going to kill me? And Bugsy said, no, there's nothing to worry about. We only kill each other. And that's what happened to Bugsy, because it was only supposed to cost $1 million to build the Flamingo, and it wound up costing $6 million because Bugsy and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, were skimming money off the top and hiding it. And the mob found out about it eventually, and they had Bugsy killed. They hunted down his girlfriend, Virginia, in Europe, and forced her to pay back all the money. She eventually committed suicide. Then other mobsters took over the Flamingo. But one of the most interesting people that I came across in doing the research for this book was a man named Moe Dalitz, who was probably the biggest gangster in Las Vegas, a gangster that no one ever heard of and never served a day in jail. I spent several hours interviewing his daughter, a woman named Susan Dalitz, who lives in Las Vegas. And Moe Dalitz started out as a bootlegger during Prohibition. When Prohibition ended, he opened gambling casinos in Kentucky and Indiana. And then World War II came, and he went into the Army, and he actually had a fairly distinguished career as a soldier in World War II. And after World War II, he decided that, Kentucky and Indiana were fine for gambling casinos, but Las Vegas would be much better. And he had been a friend and had done business with a Jimmy Hoffa from the Teamsters Union years before, because his family owned laundry businesses in the Midwest. And when unions tried to unionize the workers, he went to Jimmy Hoffa and asked if Jimmy Hoffa could help him prevent his laundries from being unionized. And Hoffa did help him. So by 1950 or 1949, when he decided to build the Desert Inn, he went to Jimmy Hoffa, and Jimmy Hoffa controlled the Central States Pension Fund, which was one of the largest pension funds in the United States. And Hoffa lent him the money through the pension fund to build the Desert Inn. And Dalitz went on to, with his partners, Morris Kleinman and a man named Robert Tucker and a fourth man named Louis Rothkopf, they were gangsters all from Cleveland. They eventually had ownership positions in about 10 casinos in Las Vegas. Eventually, they sold off their casinos, and he completely redid his career. He became a major philanthropist. He built schools, he built churches, he built synagogues, he built hospitals, he built stadiums. He became so well known and respected in Las Vegas that he was known as Mr. Las Vegas. He was invited to the presidential inaugurations of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and others. He owned the politicians, the senators and the governor in his state. And in one lifetime, he had gone from being a gangster to being a major philanthropist, winning all sorts of civic awards and being named Man of the Year by a number of nonprofit organizations. And I found this quite fascinating, because I'm currently writing a book about Hollywood and the mob. And one of the people that I start off with in that book is Joseph Kennedy, who was a mobster. But it took 3 generations of his family to go from being a mobster to having a son being president of the United States. And Moe Dalitz did it all in one generation, which was a kind of remarkable achievement, I thought. The other interesting person that I did a lot of research about was Frank Sinatra, who was not only mob connected, I discovered, but was actually owned by the mob. And his career was started by a gangster in New Jersey named Willie Moretti, who was a friend of his mother's. And Willie Moretti helped to engineer the early career of Frank Sinatra. And, you know, the mafia doesn't offer to help you develop a career unless there's something in it for them. And what was in it for them was the ownership of Frank Sinatra's career, in effect. Frank Sinatra was also a compulsive gambler and an alcoholic. After Howard Hughes bought the Desert Inn, he ran it on a much more formal business lines than it had been run before. And whereas when the mob owned the Desert Inn, Frank Sinatra was permitted to gamble and lose money and never have to repay it. And they'd still extend lines of credit for him to continue gambling. Well, after Howard Hughes bought it, that would no longer happen. If you owed the casino any money, you couldn't get any additional lines of credit for more gambling. So one night, Frank Sinatra was playing blackjack, and he lost about $50,000, and he wanted another $50,000 line of credit, and they wouldn't give it to him. Frank Sinatra went berserk. He started throwing things around the casino. A security guard told him to calm down. He threatened to kill the security guard. He went into the room with the telephone operators worked and wanted them to call a man named Carl Cohn, who was the manager of the hotel and casino. And they said, we can't. He doesn't want to be disturbed. It's the middle of the night. And Sinatra went berserk again and started ripping out the telephones in the room. And they had to call a security guard, and the security guard had to kind of tangle with Sinatra to get him out of there. And finally, at around 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, they were able to wake Carl Cohn, who agreed to meet Sinatra in what was called the Garden Room, which is like a diner off the main room of the Sands Hotel and Casino. And Sinatra was sitting there with a man named Chili Rizzo, who was his bodyguard and friend, and Carl Cohn was sitting opposite him. And Sinatra just is tearing into Carl Cohn, yelling and screaming, calling him all kinds of names. And Carl Cohn says, I don't have to put up with this. You're a jerk, and I'm leaving. And gets up to leave, and Sinatra says, what are you frightened of? Why are you leaving? And he says, I'm not frightened of anything. And he sits down, and he says, but, you know, I want to tell you that you can't behave this way. And if you continue behaving this way, we're not going to permit you here anymore. Whereupon Sinatra called Carl Cohn a dirty Jewish kike. And Carl Cohn grabbed Sinatra by his shirt collars, lifted him up, and punched him in the face and knocked out his 4 front teeth. So the man who told me this story was a man named Tony Napoli, who he was just the manager of the casino part, whose father was a mobster, who got him this job as the manager of the casino. And Tony told me he had to drive Frank to an oral surgeon to have his lips sewn up, and came back to the hotel, and Sinatra was still furious and drove his golf cart through the plate glass window of the hotel, then flew back to Beverly Hills. And he called Tony Napoli's father, a man named Jimmy Napoli, also known as Jimmy Nap, who controlled all the bookmaking for the mob on the East Coast of the United States. And Sinatra said he wanted something done to Carl Cohn. And according to what Tony Napoli said, his father responded by saying, you can't touch him. He's untouchable. He's one of us. Do you understand what I mean? He's one of us. He's untouchable. And he said, besides, look who's signing your checks. Carl Cohn is signing your checks. And the checks may be for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he's signing your checks. And Frank, you've got to understand something. You're just an entertainer. You're just an entertainer. You're not an owner here. You're not one of us. And, Frank had been treating people in the hotel very badly. So just the week before this happened, Frank was served a hamburger in the dining room, and the hamburger was not to his liking. So he threw it against the wall, and he wanted the waiter who brought it to him and the chef who made it fired. And of course that didn't happen. So anyway, he was very resented by the many people who worked in the hotel casino. So after they got news of Carl Cohn knocking out his 4 front teeth, the employees got together and they created posters of Frank Sinatra, big posters, and they blacked out his 4 front teeth. And they put these posters all over Las Vegas, and it said, "Vote for Carl Cohn for mayor." And Sinatra didn't come back to the Sands for several years after that. But then something similar happened at Caesar's Palace. Once again, he was gambling, and he didn't repay the debt there, and he wanted more chips, and they wouldn't give it to him. And it turned out this time the manager was on the floor there, a man named Sanford Waterman, and Sinatra immediately attacked him, and they were fighting on the floor, and Sinatra had his hands on this man's neck. He was choking him. The man pulled out a gun and put it to Frank Sinatra's forehead, and Sinatra got up and called him a crazy Jew and left, and didn't come back to Caesar's Palace for 4 years after that, until Sanford Waterman was fired, and then he felt that he could come back. So I found the Sinatra story very interesting, and then in further investigations, I don't know, there's a famous photograph of Frank Sinatra with the Gambino crime family that ran in Life magazine, and it was taken backstage at the Westchester Premier Theater. I guess it was in the early 70s. And I did some investigation into that, and it turned out that Frank Sinatra was singing at a nightclub in Chicago when a man named William Marston, who was a member of the Gambino crime family, called him and said, "We need you to perform at the Westchester Premier Theater." And Sinatra said, "I can't, I'm engaged here, I can't leave." And Marston said, "You better get your ass here, and you better get here by tomorrow." And no excuses. And Frank went. He arrived. So that's when I spoke to some people who knew about this, and they said, well, he was owned by the mob, and that after he had been handled by a man named Sam Giancana, and Sam Giancana, after he died or was killed, a man who I never heard of before named Louis Gomes took over, and he controlled Frank Sinatra. Now, it was also interesting, you know, sort of tangential to Las Vegas is Lake Tahoe. And there was a famous casino hotel there called the Calneva Lodge. And it was owned in partnership by Joseph Kennedy and Sam Giancana. But they had frontmen, because neither of them wanted the public to know that they owned this. And Sam Giancana's frontman there was Frank Sinatra. And I don't remember the name of the man who was from Boston who was fronting for Joseph Kennedy. But Frank Sinatra got in a fight with the head of the Gaming Control Board of Nevada and screamed and yelled at this man, and that initiated an investigation. And the Calneva Lodge lost its gambling license as a result of this. Sam Giancana was furious because it cost them $1 million to build the Calneva Lodge, and his investment was 50% of that. And he lost it because without gambling, they wouldn't make any money there. He was so furious at Frank Sinatra, he issued a contract on Frank Sinatra's life. And when Frank Sinatra heard about it, he was obviously terrified. He called Meyer Lansky in New York and begged Meyer Lansky to call Sam Giancana and get this contract rescinded. Frank Sinatra's life. The other person who was very interesting in all of this, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was Jimmy Hoffa. the Central States Pension Fund paid for most of the mob-run casinos in Las Vegas. They lent the money. What was also interesting is that they paid back all the money, and they were almost interest-free loans that they got, but they paid back all the money. Now, I also interviewed a man named Gary Jenkins, who was undercover intelligence police officer who worked with the FBI in wiretapping the West Coast, the Midwest mob families that owned 4 major hotels in Las Vegas. The most prominent of them was the Stardust. And as a result of that wiretapping, indictments were brought against the heads of these 5 mob families. The main one was in Chicago, the outfit, but there were like subsidiary mob families in Kansas City, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Cleveland. And all those gangsters were arrested, they were tried and convicted, and they all spent the rest of their lives in prison. What was interesting, I don't know if any of you saw the movie Casino. That dealt with this, but what I learned from Gary was that the character of Lefty Rosenthal, which was the character that Robert De Niro played, was actually a top echelon FBI informant, as was his wife, Barry McGee. And that's why Lefty Rosenthal, first, the man who was head of the Kansas City mob, a man named Nick Civella, suspected him of being an FBI informant. And then another mobster who was head of the Milwaukee family named Frank Billisteri also believed that he was a mob. And after all these people were indicted, they decided that Lefty Rosenthal had to go. He was saved, as it was portrayed in the movie, because there was a metal plate under the driver's seat in the car to balance the weight of the car. And that deflected the blast and blown up. But they were particularly even more angry at a man named Tony Spilotro, who's the character that Joe Pesci portrayed in the movie, because he was originally sent to Las Vegas to protect the skim. Lefty Rosenthal was put in charge of the skim in their 4 casinos, because he was considered one of the best sports handicappers in the world, according to Sports Illustrated magazine. And he knew how to maximize the profits from gambling, and also how to secretly control the skim so all the money would be sent to the different mob families. The skim was money that was taken out of the count room and not reported and sent back to the mob. And he had arrived in Las Vegas in 1969. And 2 years later, in 1971, Tony Spilotro was sent there to make sure that nobody bothered Lefty Rosenthal so that he could continue generating all this money for the mob. But Tony Spilotro was a psychopath, and he not only enjoyed killing people and doing it very sadistically, but he was also a compulsive thief. And he brought in other professional thieves from Detroit and Chicago to work with him, and they formed a gang called the Hole in the Wall Gang. And they were almost ostentatious in their thievery. And they would drill holes into jewelry stores, into hotel rooms, into people's homes, and steal loads and loads of very valuable jewelry. And it created a lot of notoriety. And this is not what the mob wanted. They wanted everyone to keep a low profile so no one would look at them. But this brought a lot of FBI investigations, which was their downfall. And they wanted to pay Tony Spilotro back for this. So they had him and his brother come to a meeting in Detroit, where Tony thought his brother would be inducted into the outfit in the basement in someone's home. And instead, the 2 of them were beaten to death in this basement. And then their bodies were trucked to a farm in Indiana, where they were buried in a cornfield. They were not dead yet. they were unconscious, but they weren't dead. And by being buried alive, they were asphyxiated. And their body was discovered only because a farmer had seen a mound of dirt and thought that someone had been poaching deer on his property and buried the remains in the farm. And he called the police, and dug up the bodies, and they performed autopsies and that. But after the mob was finally driven out of Las Vegas, it became a terrific opportunity for men who were more conventional American entrepreneurs. And there were four men, Jay Sarno, Kirk Kerkorian, Steve Wynn, and Sheldon Adelson, who built multi-billion-dollar casinos there. And what was extraordinary is the amount of money that was invested in building these, and yet their return on their investment was so much greater than the multi-billions that they spent to build the places. And they developed such an incredible brand that they were able to expand their brands all over the world, Macau and Europe, and it just made Las Vegas into a much bigger place than it was. And to give you an idea of how profitable these places are, well, Frank Sinatra was getting between $200,000 and $400,000 a week to perform, and Elvis Presley was getting between $100,000 and $150,000 a week to perform. Singers like Beyonce and Celine Dion get between $30 and $40 million a year to do 15 or 20 concerts. So they never have to perform anyplace else. The amount of money is just extraordinary. So Las Vegas has now not only become the gambling capital of the world, anyway, that's the story of my book, and I'd be very happy to answer whatever questions you may have. No questions?
If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. If audience at home, please type it in the chat.
No, I haven't. No. Well, the government has tried to put in a lot of sanctions to prevent that from happening. I guess it can happen, but it's very, very difficult. In those days, when the mob ran Vegas, there were no government employees in the count rooms. And the people who counted the money, even they were stealing from the hotel, but stealing in small enough doses so that the mob let them get away with it. They figured that was the price of doing business. But that can't be done anymore. You know, Susan Dalitz, who I interviewed for a few hours, she told me that when she was a little girl, she had freedom to wander all through the count rooms and any place else in Las Vegas, and it was amazing. Anyone could go in and out. Yes.
When the power switched in Las Vegas.
Well, the mob was actually there, not organized crime, but there were solo practitioner gangsters, so to speak, who began going to Vegas in the 1930s because gambling had been made legal in 1931. But it wasn't until after World War II that organized crime, particularly from East Coast gangsters and the Midwest gangsters, began to dominate. And they remained predominant until the end of the 19th. Well, it went all the way back to my doing Big Apple Gangsters. That in 1931, there were two organized mafia families in New York, and there were young hoodlums at the time who didn't want to do business with them, and they didn't want to do business with these young hoodlums. The young hoodlums were Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello, who all knew each other from the time when they were teenagers. So they formed something called the National Crime Syndicate, and which eventually was bigger than, you know, the 5 mafia families in New York or any mafia family, and it was national, whereas let's say the 5 mafia families of New York were just New York based. And there was tremendous interaction between the Jewish and Italian gangsters, also intermarriage between. And there's a book called the Mafia Encyclopedia, and it has the biographies of about 400 or 500 organized crime figures in it, and 50% of them are Jewish and 50% of them are Italian, and so there was a tremendous mix between the two. What was different and interesting about the two groups, though, that the Italians wanted to build dynasties, and so often their children wound up going into the mob, as with John Gotti and John Gotti's son, let's say. But the Jews didn't want their children to become mobsters. They wanted them to become doctors and lawyers and dentists and professionals. So the Jewish element died out of the mafia, and the Italian element is still prevalent there. Though there are still numerous mob associates who are. Yes. Well, Meyer Lansky was the primary owner of the 2 major gambling casinos in Havana, and he gave tribute to some other gangsters from New York, from those casinos, but he wouldn't let them move in on his territory. And when a gangster named Albert Anastasia wanted to build a casino in Havana, Meyer Lansky was looking for a way to get rid of him. And at the same time, a gangster in New York named Vito Genovese wanted to get rid of Albert Anastasia. And he called Meyer Lansky and he asked for permission to kill Anastasia. And Meyer Lansky gave him that permission. And so Albert Anastasia was killed in the barbershop of the Sheraton Hotel but then after Castro, well, Meyer Lansky had to pay what was his name, Batista, the dictator of Cuba, $1 million a year to operate. And then when Castro came in, he got rid of all the casinos, and the mob decided that they were much better off, obviously, in Las Vegas than they were in Cuba, though they had started in Las Vegas before Castro took over.
Frank Mansley. And no, it was interesting because I grew up in that climate, all right? There was the Pizza King down there, which was where they would go down there and they drop the body off in the swamp by, at that time, Idlewild Airport, now JFK, all right? And they'd be all buried back there. And I would get my pizza there. I was a little kid, you know? Then I ended up being in the business, being the only people in appliance businesses, TVs, the area, and they came to us. So it ended up John Gallo had meatballs made by his mother on a Viking range we delivered. Now, he comes in. He wants to buy a Viking range, price fixed. You can't sell it for anything less than that. We'll take the license away from you. I go, come here. We go over there, and there's a 48-inch Viking. He goes, hey, how much is it, you know? I go, it's price fixed. It can be nothing less than $12,500. A Cadillac was 10 grand, all right? And it could be nothing less than that. 3,500 for you cash. So I did grow up in that climate. It was interesting. Valley Stream was one of the hubs of the mob at that time. And the Jewish mob was basically over in Brighton Beach. So you had Brighton Beach and Howard Beach. Those are 2 areas. Now, Sal Russo, Russo's on the Bay, all right, was the place where the mob got married. Always, all right? That was it. There was no conversation about that. So anyway, I knew Sal very well because I supplied Metropolitan Construction. We built Metropolitan Avenue, all those 12-story apartments for the girls who worked in the airlines. I was a single guy. I had a hell of a single life. I got to tell you something. A little sports car, boat in the Hamptons, and a house out here. Oh, phew. I'm surprised I lived through it all, but I did. And now I'm having my second childhood. Watch out. This guy's a great guy. He paid me $5 to say that.
Any other questions? Yes. Well, when I was writing Big Apple Gangsters, I interviewed a few old mobsters, some men in their 80s and 90s, and they were very forthcoming, but they told me that they didn't want me to use their names. And I also interviewed several former district attorneys who specialized in prosecuting organized crime, and they told me that the mob is still thriving. They're just thriving in different areas than they used to thrive, but they're still there and making a lot of money. No, because I wrote facts. I didn't write to disparage or to make fun of anyone. I wanted to write history, and I never said anything that was insulting to anybody. Yes. Giancana. Well, this in the 1970s, the Senate had a Senate committee that investigated, called the Senate Committee on Assassinations, and the man who was the legal counsel came up with what was called the RICO statutes, and he believes through information that they recovered from wiretaps and so forth that the mob engineered the murder of John Kennedy. He said there was more evidence to that than anything else, and a part of the evidence that he introduced was a wiretap between Jimmy Hoffa and a man named Carlos Marcella, who was head of the mob and in which Hoffa, who was being, some say, persecuted by Robert Kennedy, said to Carlos Marcella, we've got to kill Robert Kennedy. And Carlos Marcella, who was also a target of Robert Kennedy, said to him, you don't kill a dog by chopping off its tail, you kill it by chopping off the head. And there was a lot of evidence that Robert Kennedy brought over 400 prosecutions against the mob as Attorney General. Previous Attorney Generals had never brought more than 30 indictments against mobsters, and not the top mobsters, but low-level ones. Robert Kennedy went after the biggest mobsters, and he did it, kind of fearlessly. Even Robert Kennedy, after his brother was assassinated, wondered if his brother was assassinated because of what he had done in going after the mob. So even he thought that the mob had killed his brother. Yes, they did. And that was also interesting. What I found out is because Frank Sinatra had assured Sam Giancana that he could control Robert Kennedy, that he was in with the Kennedy family, that they would listen to him, and that they shouldn't worry about him. And so they made a deal that Giancana and Mayor Daley would deliver Chicago in the presidential election. And when it turned out that Robert Kennedy didn't, that he went after the mob, and in particular Jimmy Hoffa, who was providing hundreds of millions of dollars to the mob, They at that time, Sam Giancana issued a second contract on Frank Sinatra's life. Yeah, he had a heliport. Right. Robert, yeah, Frank Sinatra then took a sledgehammer and broke up the heliport that he had built at his house. And he took down all the photographs of John Kennedy that he had all over the house. Any other questions? No? Yes? Well, years ago, I went to a talk by Mario Puzo. It was very interesting. He said, there's nothing in The Godfather that's true. He said it's nothing but a fairy tale for adults. And that's true. I mean, it's a wonderful movie. It's very exciting and interesting, but it's not based on any mafia facts. Well, that was part of it. The guy who played the Frank Sinatra part, he was also controlled by the mafia, and Frank Sinatra wanted him thrown out of the movie, and they wouldn't throw him out because there was another mafia, a guy named Russell Buffalino from Pennsylvania who owned this guy, and he said he's staying in the movie. Now, there was a guy who started the Italian American Defense League, a gangster. He took over the Joseph Colombo, and he met with the producers of The Godfather, and he made a deal with them that if they didn't want any injury done to people who made the movie, that they could never use the word mafia in the movie, and so that word never appears. And the other deal he made with them is the character who plays Michael's brother-in-law, who they kill eventually. The actor's last name was Russo, Johnny Russo, I think his name. Friend of Joseph Colombo, and Joseph Colombo said, and part of my deal is you have to give him a part in the movie. But Casino and Goodfellas are fairly accurate.
We have a question from the audience at home. Their person is asking, what do you think really happened to Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, that's very interesting because there was a man named Chucky O'Brien who was the adopted son of Jimmy Hoffa. And Chucky O'Brien's son was a federal prosecutor in the DA's office. He's written a wonderful book about his father and Jimmy Hoffa. And he names the people who he believes were responsible for the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, that it was ordered by Tony Provenzano, who was head of the Teamsters in New Jersey, and it was carried out by, and also ordered by a man named Anthony Giacolone, who was head of the mob in Detroit, and it was carried out by two brothers named the Bruciolo brothers, and one of whom was indicted, and before he could go to trial, he was coming out of a restaurant on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, and two men jumped him and shot him in the head 3 times and ran away. And I have a picture in my book of, I interviewed a former federal prosecutor who then became a criminal defense attorney named Chris Franzblau, and he gave me this picture. He represented Jimmy Hoffa, and this is a picture of Chris, and this is a picture of Jimmy Hoffa. I don't know if you can see it or far away. And I learned that was called "We Only Paint Houses," which is supposed to be about the killing of Jimmy. It's totally no truth to it at all. They had after Hoffa got out of prison, he had served a 5-year prison for jury tampering. A man named Frank Fitzsimmons was running the Teamsters Union. And he was very complacent. He did whatever the mob wanted him to do. So, and Hoffa wouldn't do everything the mob wanted him to do. So for instance, when Tony Provenzano was evicted and sent to prison, he wanted to collect his Teamsters pension. And Jimmy Hoffa said, no, you can't. You're a convicted felon. And the bylaws of the union are that you can't collect a pension if you've been convicted of a felony. Whereupon Provenzano said that he would kill Jimmy Hoffa's children and then probably eat them. He was a nutcase, and he was the one who ordered Hoffa's murder. The disposition of his body, I have no idea about. I just know from Chucky O'Brien's son, his name is Jack Goldsmith, that who killed him, and the FBI knows who killed Hoffa, but they don't have 100% certainty, so they can't release the information. It's part of their rules unless they have 100% certainty about who the killers are. I don't know about her death, but she was often a guest at the Calneva Lodge. They had underground tunnels connecting the different bungalows, and there was a tunnel specifically between her bungalow and Jack Kennedy's bungalow, and that they were always meeting. She took a lot of drugs and alcohol, and they have there was some photographs that Frank Sinatra took, according to what I read, of Sam Giancana having sex with Marilyn Monroe, and someone said that, you know, you've got to get rid of these photos; these are too damaging. But apparently, when she was on drugs, she was quite promiscuous with the guests who were at the Calneva Lodge. I don't know anything about her death, really.
From the audience at home, someone is asking, do you have any more information on the Bronx and Manhattan mafias?
There were mafia families, you know, 5 mafia families in New York, and they still exist. Most of the mafia families who were in Brooklyn have all moved to Staten Island for some reason. And some reporter recently said that 1 out of 10 residents in Staten Island is a member of the mafia.
Does anyone have any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this afternoon, and I'd like to thank everybody in the audience at home and Jeffrey Sussman for doing this very nice chat on Sin City Gangsters, the rise of the mob in Las Vegas. And there are a few copies up here for sale. If you'd like to get a signed copy, that can be accomplished. And we just have one last question. Someone at home is asking if Doc Stature was one of the founders of casinos in Las Vegas.
Yes, he was. He was an original member of what was called the Bugs and Meyer gang, which was one of the most vicious gangs in New York during Prohibition. And it was run by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel from the time they were teenagers. And they eventually got out of that, and it evolved into what was then known as Murder Incorporated. But Doc Stature was a member of that gang, and he didn't own 100% of any casino, but he owned portions of numerous casinos in Las Vegas, and he owned a restaurant in Beverly Hills.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has enjoyed this afternoon's discussion, and we'll see you again at the next one.
Thank you very much for coming.